It's a little loud.
Is this working? Is this on? No?
Yes, it's working on it. Keep talking.
Okay, we got buzz.
You got some feedback.
A little work here. Does this land? I am the chef of the future.
Is mic 2 on?
No.
Mic 2
no.
on? Mic 2
You're
on?
not.
Okay. Everything should be plugged in, right? Mic 2, mic 2. Test, test. Test, test.
Everyone's good?
Yes.
Good?
Is that on?
She's
No.
not good.
Who's not good?
No.
This one.
Craig?
Very good.
Yes. No.
No, test, test, test. Test, move, test, test. Test is always changing. Okay, there we go, test, test, test. I saw the best mind in my generation destroyed by example.
This is my,
Start, Sarah, naked.
Testing? No.
Oh, wait, almost. John's thinking.
Almost.
Try again.
Hello.
We can just pass this mic around if you have to. This one's working.
One works. Just tap it with your finger. You guys just tap that there. Enjoy your panel.
We're here to talk about Mike. How did you moderate
All
something?
right.
all right,
Okay, are you ready then?
should I, have one?
Thank you all for joining us today for our one of the first panels of the event. This is a panel remembering Forrest J. Ackerman, a very special gentleman to all of us, early founders and members of San Diego Comic Convention and fans in Southern California, Los Angeles, in the United States, and around the world. And we're going to talk about really one of the great super fans of all time, and I hope to bring some things to light about him. We're joined here by two highly qualified panelists. On my left, Don Bluth, filmmaker extraordinaire.
Oh, well, I'm one of the people that knew Forry Ackerman since 1962, and I actually got my name published in the fan section. I think along with Stephen King and Big Bill Warren, we're all in the same issue of like number 7 of the famous lines. So I go back a long way.
Oh. Very good. And on my right is Greg Baird, science fiction writer extraordinaire.
This all qualified because we all had letters published by Forry. I had 2 in 1 issue on the Boris Karloff issue, and he gave me my first pseudonym because I didn't want to publish 2 letters with the same young kid. So I became G. Gregory Urso. G. Gregorius Urso. I first met Forry back about 1966, briefly chatting with him at Stardust Hotel, just down the ways here, at the Western Front. And had been a famous monsters reader, actually more of a Spaceman fan. In those days I was more serious and constructive, and so I thought Spaceman was the more serious magazine, but I did love famous monsters as well. And eventually ran into David Clark here, and through Forry ran into Don Bluth at the famous infamous Don Bluth Film Festival, Intergalactic Film Festival. Sure, yeah, and then David Clark.
And I'm Dave Clark, person extraordinaire, early San Diego fan, and friend of these guys. And I'm here because I knew Forry Ackerman and met him at the same convention that Greg did. In 1966, there was a West Coast Science Fiction Convention right here in Mission Valley, Stardust, which is down this way a little bit. And looked in I had come back from watching some Hammer horror movies downtown in a theater, like a Rio theater downtown. I mowed lawns in the morning and then went to the movies. And I got back and I looked in the newspaper, there's a thing about a science fiction convention in town. A picture of Paul Anderson and Norman Spinrad looking at a Tolkien book. And I cajoled my father driving me down to Mission Valley late in the afternoon. And my father deserves sainthood for his service, picking me up at 1 in the morning and then bringing me back early the next day. And I walked in and there was Forrest J. Ackerman, and I was a big Famous Monsters guy. As if you asked almost any of the guys of our age group here, probably we're all Famous Monster readers like Don. Issue number 7 puts you high.
I think it was
ranked
number
first
6, right
hand.
around there. It had, all I remember, it had Albert Nutzel painting of Zach on a brownish cover or something.
I almost brought that issue.
That might have been number. No, wait a minute. I don't think it was that. It was. I think it was a Lugosi test message. Who meant test makeup.
Yes.
Island of Lost Souls. I think it's that issue.
Oh. My letter appeared in number 41, which I brought. Maybe a little story about that letter a little later.
You know, I never had a letter published in Famous Monsters. Ever. Never. I wrote lots of them, but for some reason, even though Forry and I became very close friends, and from 1962 beyond, I never got a letter published in Famous Monsters.
So what the Stephen King letter issue, you were doing what in that issue altogether?
The original, he had a list of monster club members or something. He had like a page rows with names and where you were from. And that's what my name was. And I was so proud of it. It was like seeing my name in print in a real magazine. That might have been the first time ever, you know? And so that was a big deal. Even though it was just my name in Chicago, Illinois, that's all it said.
This all segues into, I think, the core issue of Comic Fest, maybe Comic-Con in general, was the whole ferment going on in Southern California, all the way from Chula Vista and Imperial Beach, all the way up to the Bay Area, but certainly in Southern California, where we grew up. The incredible, something was going on there. I connected to it in large part through David here, because I first saw David, and he was at Thurl's Music, helping Leonard Nimoy organize his autograph party, and you were about 15?
Yeah.
So David was up on stage very intently handing out albums
Got up
and getting
there and
people lined
helping
up.
these things out.
Kevin McClary was there, a big Igorous Burroughs fan, as I recall, was there helping you with that. So I saw them, Leonard met him in high school, and this is the interesting thing. The high schools we were going to in San Diego suddenly became a star point for what's later going to become half of Comic-Con, because Scott Shaw is going to Crawford High School. I first meet Scott Shaw at David's alma mater, Horace Mann Junior High School. And then we all get together at Crawford High School. And through that, but even before that, we are aware of each other's presence, and suddenly we all come together. But what's the center of this is Forry Ackerman's mansion. The Acker Mansion was the place where we would later meet Don Bluth, where we would run into Ray Harryhausen for the first time in our lives. And about the same time period, about 67, we run into Ray Bradbury. And who do you know that put Ray Bradbury on the map to meeting Ray Harryhausen and so on? But Forrest J. Ackerman. So that was back in 1938, 39, that Forry was already matchmaking between friends and putting things together and organizing stuff. And just to watch, just to hear the history of 1939 World Science Fiction Convention, where Forry Ackerman shows up in a Wings costume from Things to Come, a technocrat, a true technocrat. Ray Bradbury shows up with Hannes Bach folio of art under his arm, going around to the magazine people in New York to sell Hannes Bach, who later moves out there and starts doing this sort of thing. It's echoed over and over and over again in Southern California, from Los Angeles on, this gathering.
A great story about Forry's. Is there anyone here who doesn't know who Forrest Ackerman is? Okay, good. We're preaching to the choir. That's good. All right, give me an amen. Forry at the Worldcon, the first Worldcon in 1939, and of course, there's a watershed mark in the self-awareness of fandom. And Forry went, and he went, as Greg says, in this very futuristic-looking costume. And there were several other things going on around town. The World's Fair was going on, so they went to the World's Fair. There are pictures of the various fans of Forry, and there's pictures of Ray Bradbury sitting on rides that were taken at the World's Fair. But there was an Esperanto conference, like a World Esperanto conference. And Forry Ackerman, among his many accomplishments and talents, was a dedicated Esperantist. Esperanto was an invented language to try to give the world a common language that had a simple grammar structure. One of the first times I met Forry, he explained the grammar structure to me. And he told me, he was the person who introduced me to the idea of Esperanto. So he went in his costume from the Worldcon. He went to the Esperanto conference, and, which was, I guess, in the park, and they had a dais so that anyone could get up and speak. And he got up and in fluent Esperanto told the people assembled that he was a visitor from our future. Bring good news to them. Oh, it's a really great moment.
We have not been born yet, but we remember it well.
So for those of us fans of a later era, and we certainly have plenty of hijinks and pranks and the kinds of things that we did, it's no different from the spirit from the guys and a couple of gals that got together in the 1939 Worldcon.
You know, Forry sometimes passively became a pivotal piece of bigger puzzle. I grew up in Chicago, but I live in California, and I pursued careers in writing and making movies and all sorts of things. That may never have happened if Forry Ackerman had owned the movie projector. And I don't know if I ever told this story before, but I was living in Chicago. I was going to college there. I enrolled in DePaul University. My hobby then was making amateur movies that I used to shoot in the basement, in the backyard, the local cemeteries, the forest, wherever, you know. And I wrote a letter because there was a writer who was then working for Famous Monsters named Ron Haydock, who I'd been corresponding with, and he wrote a little story about me in Famous Monsters about my amateur films. So I was getting close to graduation from high school, and my mother said, "What would you like for a graduation present?" I said, "I'd really like to take a trip to California and visit Ron Haydock and Bob Burns and some of these people in Forry Ackerman." So she said, "Okay, we'll do that." So I wrote a letter to Forry, and about 3 days later, by, as he would say, spatial delivery, the doorbell rang, and there was a letter from Forry, a special delivery letter, and he said, "Come out and bring all your amateur movies." And I made like, by that time, about 35 of them, and carried them 16 millimeter cans in a suitcase. So I went out to visit Forry, and he came out to his house. Now, Forry arranged for, first of all, Bird-Eye Gordon to be the guy who produced Amazing Colossal Man. So that was a big deal. A kid from Chicago meeting a real director, producer, who's going to look at my movies. But Forry did not own a projector. And a guy showed up at the house named Ray Craig, who I saw as recently as 2 weeks ago. Ray bought the projector. He was a young guy. He was about 20 years old, 21. And I said, "Well, is this your projector?" And he said, "No." Oh, Forry didn't collect movies because he didn't have any place to put them. He had a few in his refrigerator. So he didn't want to get into that because he had a space limitation. So I said, "Is this your projector?" And he said, "No, I brought this over before. I borrowed this from USC Film School." I said, "You borrowed these from what?" USC Film School. I said, "Are you telling me that there's a school that you can go to and your homework is making movies?" Ray said, "Yeah." I said, "I'll take you down to the campus and show it." So after the showing at Forry's house of these movies, and also the fact that Bert Gordon never put them down, he never said, you know, "Go get a day job, these are crummy," or whatever. You know, he was very encouraging to me, and even asked me how I did at one or two of the shots. And Ray took me over, showed me the campus, he showed me the editing equipment, the rooms and everything. And I made the decision at that point that no matter what it took, I was going to go 2 years to get my requirements out of the way in Chicago, and then I was going to move out to California to go to USC Film School. And if they didn't accept me, if they didn't accept all my credits, I was still going to move out to USC Film School. And I told my mother when I got back to the hotel, "I moved to California, I'm going to USC." Now, if Forry had a projector, I may never have found out about USC Film School until after I graduated from DePaul and some subject I had no interest in. So it's funny how these little things can happen. You know, somebody you meet in passing or whatever for 5 minutes or whatever can become an integral part in your own future life history. And so that's what Forry, and Forry didn't even know that. He just you know, "Oh, I don't have a projector." That was it. And I'm still living in California.
Maybe we should say a little bit about the Acker Mansion. And say the Acker Mansion, there actually were several.
Two big ones and one of the last.
And the Acker Mansion that I visited, and Greg, and Dawn certainly early, was on South Sherborne Drive.
915 South, Spaceborne Drive.
Spaceborne Drive, yeah. And it was a Spanish-style two-story house It wasn't huge, really, and the house that went back from the living room back to Forry's office, which was a dense den toward in the back. If you look on YouTube, there are videos of Forry talking there. So there are a number of them that were shot there and at the new Acker Mansion. And in the 60s, the fans went to visit Forry, all went to that Sherborne Drive address. Then, I'm not sure, when did he move, in the 90s?
He moved, I think it was in the 80s.
In the 80s.
And I remember when he lived in the original house, the collection just got so big, he actually had an apartment a couple blocks away that he actually did most of his actual living in.
And
The house became more of an office, and he had a stack on, behind, this is before people had computers, but behind his typewriter, his desk, on his chair that you see on, he had a stack about this high. It had some notebooks, some stills, whatever the stuff was, it was about this high. And what that was, it was the only, these were things he didn't have space for to put anywhere, so he would come in, pick up this stack, sit in the chair, put the stack on his lap, and work all day. He would take the stack off his lap, get up, put it back on the chair, and that was it.
A day I spent in the Acker Mansion, when you left, you were exhausted because no matter where your eye went, there was some fascinating object. Rare books, paintings, there were artworks, every fantasy, science fiction artist that you can think of.
Lot tricks in one corner.
Beautiful Hannes Bach paintings.
But he had no organization.
It was all there.
That was so crazy. He would have like an original Willis O'Brien animation model from King Kong. And right next to it would be like a Frankenberry student or something, you know. And then next to that would be a model kit of the submarine from Voyage to the Bottom of this real hodgepodge.
Yeah, there was no serious attempt at curation of the collection.
Yeah.
He just loved to collect, and he loved for people to see the collection. The beautiful thing about Forry was that he really liked other people to see it. He was no dragon sitting on a hoard of idle gold. He loved to collect this stuff, but he wanted you to see it, and he wanted you to be enthusiastic. I think the payoff for Forry was all the young people seeing this stuff and going, wow! You know, and I was thinking about, Forry came up in the science fiction of the 20s and early 30s, which was the aesthetic was sense of wonder. And Forry often talked about sense of wonder, and that was the kind of science fiction that he liked. E.E. Doc Smith, you know, galaxies, spanning.
He was
He was famous for famous monsters, but I think his true first love was the kind of serious, constructive, hard science fiction, space opera, the future, things to come, Metropolis, all this sort of thing was where his heart was. The rest of it he loved also, and he could certainly make a career out of it because no one else was doing it. But if you go back to the original Forry Acker Mansion, that costume was from Things to Come, which was made 3 years earlier. And that's, I think, that's certainly how I kind of connected with him. Olaf Stapledon, he had a large collection of Stapledon. He had actually sent books to Stapledon to have him autograph them, and had a few of them left out of the box 20 years later. You know, that kind of thing was what he loved to do.
And I asked him once, I said, what do you really prefer, the monster movies, horror films, and science fiction, what type of science fiction? And he told me basically what you just said. He really liked the stuff from when it was still called science fiction.
Yeah. That's
That's what he liked. He liked things to come, H.G. Wells, that sort of thing. I think the monsters was just something that was kind of dumped in his lap by James Warren, and he kind of went with it. But I don't think he
Because he lived in Horrorwood.
You know, when he walked in the new house, and he told me that it once belonged to John Hall, the actor, and I said, well, he had this hallway with a bathroom candidate. So I went, oh, the Hall of John. But he loved puns, of course. But I think he looked at the horror films that it was more of a job, but his heart was in the old science fiction stuff.
Yeah. I did some research on the origins of famous monsters, and there's a kind of an interesting story. Forry went to France to attend a science fiction convention in the 50s, 56 or 57, and while he was there, he bought off the newsstand a beautiful magazine of horror, American horror movie stills, beautiful reproductions of nice stock with a lot of writing in French. And he brought it back, and then soon after met James Warren, who was publishing a men's magazine. What was it
Yeah,
called?
After Hours.
After Hours. And he showed this to Warren, or maybe he sent it to him. And Warren really liked the idea. He thought, well, we'll reprint this in America. And so he paid somebody to do a translation. But the text, as you'd express from a French cinema magazine, was extremely intellectual. Far more than he thought a magazine could sell here.
Tires de monsters.
And the monster picture, the stills had all been returned to their collectors. They weren't from one collection. And so he's going, oh, well, now we can't get the rights to them. And then Forry said, well, you know, in California, I have rather a lot of these. Why don't you come out and see? And so Warren flew out and went to Ackerman's house. And they spent the next couple of days, they, I guess, stayed up all night. Almost 2 days they worked on this thing and put together the first issue of Famous Monsters, entirely from Forry's.
But there is an
collection.
issue of After Hours, before Famous Monsters #1 came out, that had the article. It was almost like a preview of Famous Monsters. It was an article on science fiction movies and horror films, and Forry wrote it and had the stills in it. I have that issue somewhere.
I've never seen one of those.
Yeah, and you know, because it was a men's magazine, they tried to get sexier pictures. You know, they had a lot of girls and things too. Yeah, it's kind of a collector's item.
Yeah.
So Forry was a huge fan of all kinds of motion pictures, as most kids were growing up in Southern California in the 20s and 30s and 40s. You mentioned that I think we got to kind of correct this view that he loved science fiction first, but if he had all those stills from monster movies, he was collecting stills and posters in large quantity of all sorts.
Well, he early on figured out how to work the studio publicity departments. And I did this when I was a kid. I don't know if you wrote for stills, but you could write to the studio for stills and they would give them to you. He probably went over there. And
I used to go to the National Screen Service and buy posters. One sheet, like 22 cents a piece.
So if you're living in LA, and
Well, this is Chicago, so I can imagine LA would be.
LA, that stuff had to be ambient, and he was collecting everything.
All around Hollywood Boulevard were these wonderful bookstores, Collector's Bookstore.
I worked there once, one of my only jobs I ever had.
And was almost always there when we were at the Acker Mansion. And it was kind of our in-between age group between us and Forry, not that we needed, because Forry was always a kid anyway. But all of that enthusiasm, arranging for the meetings, setting these things up, driving up from San Diego every week and a half or so to do something in LA. That Acker Mansion was a central part of this. And I recall that Forry had far too many books. But where there was wall space where books were not visible, he had false bookshelves where you paint in titles.
Wallpaper with book spines.
With book spines, where you could paint in your own titles.
It would let visitors, I know John Pound, Scott Shaw, you and myself all wrote titles. Of course, when the Sherborne House went, those disappeared.
It's gone because it's not there anymore. It's an apartment building. So that whole idea of this kind of cool place where you could be a kid forever was part of Los Angeles. Not just science fiction culture, but all of Los Angeles culture. Ray Bradbury picks up on it. He makes his coin-eyed Martians who live forever, basically Hollywood, Los Angeles characters. And the Mr. Electrico tells him live forever and never grow up and keep your Buck Rogers strips and everything. He and Forry and a lot of the people around them were very much that way, where they says, yeah, you've got to become an adult. That doesn't mean you have to grow up. You don't want to become old and stodgy. You want to continue to love what you love. And boy, did Forry do that. You could just tap into any single one of his enthusiasms, and he could go on for hours about that. And he had the goods. He had the history. He could tell you stories. And now that's all in our subconscious. You know, all the stories we heard from those guys and from the people who were around them. David and I think David got us out to see one time when we were visiting in LA to see Marcel Delgado, which is an interesting story.
We were staying at Greg's grandmother for a few days, but I think it was when we went to see 2001: A Space Odyssey when that was new. And I picked up the phone book.
And playing names from the same one.
And I started looking for names, and there was Marcel Delgado, the guy the sculptor who built the King Kong models and the Lost World models, worked with Willis O'Brien, was most closely associated with Willis O'Brien for his whole career. And there he was in the phone book, so I called him up. said, Mr. O'Brien, we're King Kong fans, we're in town for a week. Mr. Delgado, we're in town for a week, and I wondered if we could meet you. And he said, sure, come on by the house.
That was wonderful.
And so none of us drove, Greg's grandmother drove us. And we went out to his house.
Very pleased to meet this Latino gentleman.
And we sat with him for several hours talking. He told us the whole story of what he'd done in the
It was
business,
extraordinary.
making
This is
silent
the
movies.
guy who sculpted King Kong, who Willis O'Brien approached in an art school in New York in the 1930s, saw his sculptures, actually 1920s, earlier maybe, and said, would you like to come out? Well, what do you know about Marcel Delgado, Don?
I never heard the story, so you probably know more about it than I do.
I know the
Okay.
story is that Delgado was going to art school in LA, and he was working his way through, and O'Brien was looking for sculptors, and he went to this art school, and he saw a very fine bull, the sculpture of a bull. He said, that's really nice, who did that? And he said, the guy sweeping the floor over there. Delgado was working his way through art school as the janitor. And so O'Brien said, oh, you know, I'd like to work in the movies, you know, I've got to work on a film. He said, no, I really want to finish my education. I'm really listening to
Sweeping the floor.
Yeah. So he said, well, okay, here's my card. If you'd like to see a movie studio, come on down to First National. Just give them this card and they'll let you in. Delgado said, well, who doesn't want to see a movie studio? So down he goes, and O'Brien meets him and gives him a tour of the studio. And they go into this room that's got everything a sculptor could conceivably want. It's got lathes and things and all, machine shop, the whole works. And he says, what do you think of this? And he said, this is really great. O'Brien said, it's yours if you want it. and that was the day he went to work for Willis O'Brien, and they built models for the Lost World.
Now, there have been a fair number of animated films. We can get off on another Forry digression here, because stop motion animation was one of our passions, and when we went to the Acker Mansion, we had to know everything there was to know about it. The whole sequence of, there are so many strange stop motion moments. There's a number of silent movies that have quite considerable stop motion in them. Buster Keaton's 3 Ages of Age has a brontosaurus sequence in it, which I'm not sure.
Dinosaurs.
Pardon?
Dinosaurs.
Oh, I go back to Thunder Lizard myself. I'm an old traditionalist here. I think Pluto was a dinosaur too. But Yugoth, right? The whole history of stop motion animation could be seen. You could walk into Forry's house and there's models from Earth versus the Flying Saucers sitting there, Washington D.C. models, which I guess Ray had loaned to Forry, but they were there. And so we would eventually bring things to contribute to this hagiography here, this museum of sacred objects. So I sculpted a head of the Emer very meticulously in clay and model paint, and put it in a little watch case box, and took it to Forry and says, here, and he put it on the shelf, and it was there for the next 2 years. I don't know what happened to it, but he never removed our contribution.
It was funny, sometimes Forry would forget the origin of some of the things he got, and he probably thought that was one of Ray's, I was going to go to the Worldcon in World Science Fiction Convention around when it was like 1972, whenever it was in LA, and I decided to go as Dr. Doom, the comic book character, and I made this paper mache Dr. Doom mask, pretty much like the character. But then when I found out how much it was going to cost to rent a suit of armor and all this, and they have to walk around in that thing, I decided, no, I'll go as Frankenberry instead, which I did, and I won first prize. But I had this Dr. Doom mask, and so I gave it to Forry. I said, hey, maybe you can do something. And ended up with his memorabilia from silent movies, and he totally forgot that I made this thing and gave it to him, So sometimes he would sort of forget. So maybe he thought that was a hairy house.
So along the way at the Acker Mansion, we would meet these people who are doing really wonderful stuff. And some of the best title cards in movies ever came from the Don Bluth Intergalactic Film Festival. We never forgot that. And later on, Don becomes one of these world's experts on dinosaurs, which is a double cool interconnection here. Creating the Dinosaur Encyclopedia, and of course, large numbers of volumes on pulp and movies and comics. And
I
stuff.
do anything to avoid getting a job.
Yeah.
Voiceover acting, I'm a musician.
You know that Steven Spielberg, was it about 2 years ago, came out with Super 8. which I don't know.
I shot mine at 16.
Did you see Super 8?
No, I haven't seen it.
That was,
Oh.
that was Abrams, produced by.
It's a loving look at the lifestyle that Greg and myself, and of course Don, we were all home horror movie producers. And I shot in Super 8. I mean, I shot in regular 8. Don, you shot in 16.
But the real difference, you know, and I don't want to make this about me, because it's, but I never started making amateur movies because I wanted to make amateur movies. I started making amateur movies because I wanted to show them in my house, and movies with monsters, dinosaurs, and werewolves and things. And in those days, you couldn't buy them. Castle Films was putting out westerns and cartoons and things, but no horror films, no science fiction films. And I saw The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. I want to see that movie in my house anytime I want on my screen with my projector. And you couldn't, there were no VCRs or no DVDs. So I figured the only way to do that was to make my own. Then I wanted to show my own Frankenstein movie. You know, so I had to make my own. And that's the way I started. It wasn't later that the bug kind of caught me. And I said, hey, I like doing this, so let's make a hobby and then find a career.
The timeline perspective on this is fascinating. As I get older, I see things in longer than 5-year intervals. And if we look back to when we went to see the projection, the rare, extremely rare movie of The Most Dangerous Game.
I was there.
Anyone had seen, exactly. Forry shows it, and we all show up, and we're told the history that this was shot just around the same time that King Kong was shot, on many of the same sets. And it's really a wonderful, fast-paced film, just a totally lovely film. And we can't see this on TV. Meanwhile, Bob Burns is working, I believe, over at CBS, local CBS affiliate, editing films for putting them on TV. So if you did see a film on TV, poor Bob, the great enthusiast, had to cut these films down to fit commercial breaks.
Yeah, or censored scenes out.
Yeah, and Bob Burns was also one of the great Los Angeles characters, still is, has a huge collection. Perhaps in some respects rivals, if not exceeds, Forry's collection. And
He's got the time machine.
he's got the actual time machine, which
How
they
about that?
bought from a traveling trailer show and refurbished along with a bunch of the fans we knew in Los Angeles. And yeah, this thing just goes on and on and on. All of the connections around Forry. Let's go back to the 1940s and Clifton's Cafeteria, which apparently was not a haunt for years and years, but for a brief period of time was the place where all the science fiction community got together. Forry, Ray Harryhausen, Ray Bradbury, Jack Williamson, Robert Heinlein, Robert Bloch, I believe, are all in one photo of Clifton's Cafeteria.
And the story is that Forry persuaded Harryhausen and Bradbury to come to a meeting on the same Thursday night.
Yeah.
And so they walked in and then he introduced the two.
I
We
think
became
Ray
lifelong
was
friends.
thinking, where can I get a poster of King Kong? And Forry was saying, I think this guy Ray Harryhausen may have one, and they became fast friends. And Ray Harryhausen was the best man at Ray Bradbury's wedding. And so Ray was introduced to Ray by Forry. Now, I had the fun job in 1996, some round about there, of going to the King Kong 65th anniversary. But before that, I'd actually interviewed Ray Harryhausen, Ray Bradbury, and Julie Schwartz, all together. Julie Schwartz, another Comic-Con favorite, was also an agent and editor and writer back in the 30s. He had been Lovecraft's first agent, and he had been Stanley Weinbaum's first agent. And so he had pictures of Stanley Weinbaum in the 1930s. He didn't live to see the World Cup. Weinbaum was dead by the time the first World Cup came. All that history comes in and out. And again, that interconnectedness just fascinates me, because you have to think of, when was The Most Dangerous Game made? 1933. Okay? When were we watching it? About 32 years later, about 35 years later. Maybe 36, 37 years later. How long has it been since we saw that film?
40 years.
40 years, yeah. So 50 years, actually, almost. You know? And you begin to watch these vast, between the time that you first visited the